puzzled quite a long time about how to begin this lecture, because I wanted to stress, along with the many similarities between Chinese and Western philosophy, some of the differences. In fact, Chinese philosophy derives from a worldview that is very, very different from our own. And it is an understanding of that difference that becomes a key to really understanding Chinese philosophy. So what we've done here is on your far left, you see two words. One is an ideograph in the Chinese. The other is in the Greek. If you count over 4 to the 4th Chinese figure, which is the first actually, Chinese being read opposite to English, that is the figure Wei. Wei means being. Down here is the Greek eimi, which is Greek for being. Our dialect, our philosophy derives very much from the Greek. Now, a study of these two will show you, first of all, that one is a visual configuration. It's a pattern. The Chinese figure is, in a sense, like art. And if it were drawn with a calligrapher's brush, it would have something like the flow of water to it. Whereas what you see in the Greek is symbolic of an oral communication, a sound. There's a vital difference in the perception of reality between those, because the sound is more symbol than the configuration is. The world that we see is a configuration of patterns. The world that we hear, however, does not seem like that to us. So in a sense, we're a step removed immediately when we look at languages as written in the West. It's a more distinct question, though, than simply that, because in the Chinese, the concept of being has very much to do with activity, with doing things, with making. This is the way that the Chinese look at the idea of being. In the Greek, being has to do with presence. If something is present, then we say that it is. If something is absent, then it is not. Very different outlook, and it has tremendous ramifications in the development of the two philosophies. In the Greek, we get metaphysics. Why is it that things disappear and appear? How is it that they appear and disappear? There's a lot of anxiety. What happens when I disappear? In the Chinese, there is what has been called a practical consideration. How do I do what I should do? What is the best way to do it? And in fact, what are the things that I should be doing? It's a much less mental and more applicable approach to philosophy. Whatever metaphysics develops out of the Chinese develops as a justification for practice, a means of making the reason for practice much clearer. Other than that, it is completely ignored. And in fact, we'll see that in later China, as Buddhism enters the picture and combines with Daoism, Zen Buddhism emerges, and Zen completely rejects the metaphysics and considers it so much as words. And in fact, a Zen pupil who approached his teacher, his Roshi, with a question about metaphysics would likely get a slap in the head so that he would remember to be present to the now and not abstracting into useless intellectual vagaries. There are two schools of main thought that are indigenous to China, the Confucian and the Taoist. In the West, there's a tendency to perceive these two as being quite separate, almost antithesis of one another. There's some truth to this in that politically they did argue with one another quite often. However, the average Chinese individual was something of a Confucianist and a Taoist. There was really no problem in putting both to practice. And it is this slant that we will stress today, because the combination of Confucianism and Taoism provides a wonderful balance between the inner and outer necessities of life. Taoism serves to restore a sense of contact with nature and with spiritual realities. It serves to in a certain extent, explain these feelings that one can have of refreshment in spiritual realities. Confucianism, on the other hand, deals with the practicalities of life, dealing with the family, dealing with friends, dealing with career and society and government. Often they stepped into one another's categories, usually without happy result. The Taoist who stepped into politics usually became a hermit and avoided society entirely. And Confucius once wrote that he had starved himself all day, meditated, and had found out nothing from this activity, and therefore it was a waste of time. In general, it's best to let them apply to what they were intended to apply to. So what we'll do is we'll begin with Confucianism, then we'll go into Daoism and compare them as we go along. Confucius lived about 2,500 years ago. A very sobering thought, because his moral philosophy is among the most excellent ever produced. There is very little in any subsequent development of philosophy or religion that is not included in Confucianism or in its partner Daoism, which developed at the same time. Confucius was the son of a somewhat noble family. He, from a very young age, is said to have been a tremendous scholar. And in fact, his whole life he stressed learning, quite the opposite of his Taoist confederates. He felt that self-cultivation was the principal task of every human being, that one should expose oneself to beauty, to art, to learning, and that this is the means by which the essential humanity of the human being, that which makes a human being truly good, would be released. Confucius had a lot of interest in politics. He lived during what has been called the Warring States period, when there were from 120 to 70 states in war against one another, some of them no larger than a small suburb in one of our cities. He suffered quite a bit of exile, perhaps some torture, if not in actuality, at least psychologically, in that he was separated from his parents, he was separated from his son and from his wife. He had to move quite often because his view of virtue and of the way in which a government should be run was very much contrary to the prevailing views of the time, and could be quite an annoyance to the more frisky leaders of the period who enjoyed war and harems and that sort. Confucius was an embarrassment to them. He did, however, attract a circle of disciples who he received great joy from. Simply being with them somehow comforted him. And although he was quick to reprimand and to point out some of their faults, they were an extraordinary group of people. And in fact, quite comparable to the group of young men which Socrates was gathering around him at the same time in Greece, one of the great coincidences of history. Confucius lived in a period when the old ways had seemed to fall into degradation. There were great legends of a golden age, of great emperors like the Yellow Emperor, who was a healer and a great learned man, and who had kept his nation happy and at peace. Confucius continually referred back to these legends, continually referred back to the writings written in those times, like the I Ching. It is said that he wore out 3 copies of the I Ching in reading it. His philosophy represented then a return to what he felt was the essence of this golden age, and that was propriety. Propriety is shown in the third character from the left, Li. What it represents is very interesting. On the left of the figure is a spirit. On the right, on top, is a sacrificial vessel. And on the bottom is a man with his hands out offering. Confucius took this basically almost shamanistic religious view, the idea of sacrifice to the spirits, and applied it to life in general. He said this, that in everything one does, in speaking to a friend, even when alone, in work and in play, One should have the attitude that one has when making an offering to the ancestors. One should be alert, aware, sincere. One should care about what one is doing. That if this attitude, this li, this propriety, can be applied in all parts of life, then the human being has truly begun to achieve their potential. You might suspect that great lists were drawn up about what you could do and what you couldn't do. This was only partially the case. Confucius was more interested really in the idea that one had to follow whatever customs were current at the particular time if they seemed to conform to the development of these virtues. So if one lives in a society where it is important to say thank you, one says thank you. The reason being that through saying thank you, true thankfulness is eventually developed. The goal of all of this is that the sage no longer has to think about what he or she should do, but rather simply does it. The sage becomes completely spontaneous and is good in his or her essential being, so that every activity of the sage is right, is good, is in harmony. And therefore, the sage no longer needs to use the mind or custom to decide what should or shouldn't be done. Confucius said that he had achieved this by the age of 70, after a life completely devoted to that. At that age, he said, he could follow his heart's desires without being misled. Very rare talent. Confucius also talked about something called the rectification of names. The rectification of names meant that somehow language had changed, that somehow words that were supposed to have a virtue in them, a meaning to them, no longer had that meaning. So, for instance, the word a nobleman came to mean someone who was born of a noble family. To Confucius, this was nonsense. Somehow language had fallen away from what it should have been, because a noble man or a noble woman should be noble in character. Confucius took this so far as to say that no obedience is owed to a king who is a king only in name. So that persons who bring the question up of whether or not a father should be respected if the father beats the child would be answered with the observation that the father is not a father if the father beats the child. Therefore, the filial piety is not due. One must be what one's name indicates. A king must be a king. And later, one of Confucius's brightest disciples, who's compared very much to Plato, Mencius, went so far as to say that spirits and gods who do not do what they're asked to do should also be replaced, because they obviously do not deserve the title, and kings are owed absolutely no fealty if they are not just kings. Very revolutionary stance for the period, and in fact it did have some interesting repercussions politically. Well, how does one become virtuous? What is the key? Confucius offered two approaches to becoming virtuous, both of them connected with this idea of the practice of propriety. One of them was the famous Golden Rule. However, in Confucian terms, it was stated in a dual sense. It was not only doing unto others, but also not doing unto others what you did not want done to yourself. You used the measure of yourself. You did for others what you would like done for yourself, and you did not do to others what you would not like done to yourself. You were conscious of this all of the time. You judged your actions with forethought, using, again, the measure of yourself, your own desires. Confucius presupposed that this was a moral world. He believed that heaven and earth were in harmony, and that men, by self-will, were capable of becoming disharmonious, and that human growth was, in a sense, a question of becoming harmonized with heaven and earth. restoring the primal harmony. Therefore, Confucius felt that men were instinctively good, could be trusted, that very much environment had a negative influence on human beings, that bad influence, bad example had tremendous impact, and he especially looked to leaders as being guilty of this. Confucius once wrote that the leader was like a wind and the country like grass, and that when the wind would blow, the grass must bend. It's equally true that the grass would bend to the good or to the evil. And Confucius felt that there was a tremendous responsibility for the ruler to present a virtuous example. This virtue was infectious. It would spread to other persons. Other persons would see this example and would be motivated by it, would begin to imitate. And the result would be a harmonious nation, and perhaps the spread to an harmonious world. Confucius also believed that propriety was a means of maintaining harmony in society. Now, this is somewhat based on the principles of yin and yang. These are more explicit in Daoism, but the fact that we know that Confucius studied the I Ching so deeply tells us that many of his beliefs were based on the idea of yin and yang. Briefly, yin and yang represent the principles of polarity in the universe. Yin is considered the feminine, the receptive, the dark. Yang is considered the light, the masculine, the going out force. Ideally, the world and human life should be a mixture in balance of these two. It's possible to say that Confucianism is a bit more yang and Daoism quite a bit yin. In fact, in the Lao Tzu, the great Taoist scripture, it is said that Taoism is excessively yin because it is a corrective. It is an attempt to restore balance. Therefore, it is heavy to the side of the feminine and receptive. The Li, the practice of propriety, involves this balance of yin and yang in everyday life. Some practical examples might be helpful. For instance, if a person is in a situation where they feel that they have some very good advice for another person, the trick would be not to say, you should do this is the thing to do, and badger them into it. Even if you're convinced you're right, this is not the balanced approach. The balanced approach is to point out the situation, to very gently give an opinion, and then to leave the question open, to say, and now, what do you think? The person is then open to respond as they wish. Now, this would be a balanced approach. Were one to take the more yang approach and to say, this is what you should do, well, there are two possibilities. The person to whom we are speaking can choose to be very yin and balance us and say, of course, that's precisely what I will do. Or they can choose to be yang and say, I don't care what you think I should do, I'll do what I want to do. And now we have disharmony rippling through our cosmic sphere. And this simple example is the sort of thing that begins a great process, virtual waves of disharmony. One person angers another person. That spreads to the people that this person meets in the street. And it spreads on as the days pass. On the other hand, one person who is within harmony is able to harmonize his or her surroundings, is able to calm those who are angry, and is able to bring insight to those who are blinded by the passions of the moment. So this judicious use of yin and yang, which should remind us of alchemy, because indeed it is a very similar process, the difference being mainly that in alchemy we speak of 3 or 4 elements, 5 in the Chinese, and in Confucianism and in Chinese philosophy in general we speak of 2, of yin and yang. Nevertheless, they are both processes of balancing and transformation through balance. This process has a cumulative effect. It is very difficult when one begins. It's very hard to be continually conscious, to be aware, to notice every activity. And it's very simple to make a mistake and suddenly berate oneself and say, it's impossible, I cannot possibly do this. It's a struggle. We have to remember that Confucius, claiming that he began at the age of 15, took some 55 years to begin to approach that kind of development. At any rate, as we continue the practice, it does get easier and easier. The awareness becomes more natural. And it was perhaps this cumulative effect which Confucius referred to when he spoke about the sage who was absolutely spontaneous, whose every action was good and right and harmonious. In a sense, referring back to Buddha, who said that we are our thoughts become transformed, and more of these thoughts become positive. And as more of them do, they have a cumulative energy, and it becomes easier to stay within that flow of energy. Now we'll switch to Daoism for a moment to give a little contrast here. There's a wonderful story which is given by a very trustworthy historian. Whether it's true or not, however, we do not know. About a meeting between Confucius and Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, which means the old man or the old philosopher, was the great patriarch of Daoism, the founder of it. Confucius was supposed to have conceived a desire to meet Lao Tzu over all other things, and when he came to visit the capital, where Lao Tzu worked as imperial guard of the archives, the great delight of his visit was the opportunity to meet Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu by then was old, and the picture which the historian gives us is of a rather cranky man. And Confucius stepped in expecting to bask in the light of this sage, and was told basically that he should stop his lustful, prideful ways, stop worrying about what other people are thinking about, and learn to coincide with the Tao. And that was all Lao Tzu had to tell him. And so unceremoniously dismissed, Confucius was supposed to have said to his followers, I can understand how the fish is snared and the bird is shot, and I can understand how the deer runs, but I do not understand the dragon who can fly and disappear in the clouds. Today I have seen Lao Tzu, and I can only compare him to the dragon. Whether the story is true or not, it is very illustrative of the virtues and the difficulties of both of these philosophies, and it provides an excellent door for us to enter into consideration of Daoism. Because you see, Lao Tzu, the Taoist, looks at Confucius, the man of reason, the man of learning, and says, what you are interested in is nothing. It's distraction, waste of time. You're abstracting yourself. You're missing the point. On the other hand, the man of reason, Confucius, looks at Lao Tzu and doesn't understand, says he's like a dragon, incomprehensible. We could say that this is the story of philosophy and history. It is. The argument between the men of reason and logic who say, you spiritual types, doesn't make any sense, it's all airy and cloudy. And the spiritual types who say, oh, you logicians missed the whole point, and it's just a abstraction that you are indulging yourself in. In fact, the story can be taken in reference to ourselves, because these two philosophers argue within every one of us. And when the reason is in dominion, it pronounces judgment on the spiritual. And when the spiritual is in dominion, very often it pronounces judgment on the reason. And one who studies both the dry, more logical aspects of philosophy and the more spiritual will quickly notice that there are times when the harmony is a little bit out of sync. And what one discovers is that the logic reads like so much gibberish, and the spiritual work reads like so much gibberish. It all depends on which side of the mind or spirit one is coming from at that point. And it does well to realize that each is intended for a different person, for a different purpose. The spiritual is an internal movement. Reason is an external movement. Reason is intended to help us deal with the world. And again, is exemplified by the Confucian approach. The internal movement of spirit is meant to restore connection with spiritual verities, with principle, with our source. And this movement is, again, typified by Daoism. Daoism, the main text of Daoism, can be read as the most profound and most thought-provoking, and in some sense the most serene of all religious and mystical writings. There's a quality to it that is really most comparable to water, to still water. However, it can also be read as an absolutely incomprehensible mess, and has been done so by Western philosophers. The truth of the matter is in reference, again, to these two different parts. The Lao Tzu is intended to frustrate the reason, and a human being who reads the Lao Tzu, intending to use reason on it, to dissect it, will be supremely frustrated. The text is every bit as talented as a Zen master in defeating reason. In fact, the first line of it, when translated exactly, is, "The Tao that can be Taoed is not the permanent Tao." Very difficult to make sense out of with a pure logic. However, if we put logic and reason aside and we begin to listen with the heart, we begin to see and understand things in this text that would be indescribable in normal use of language. This brings us to a very interesting aspect of Daoism. The idea that this fall from the Golden Age, which Confucius spoke about and which we have mentioned, was really a fall into thought. In the Taoist writings, it is said that first there was the Tao, and then there was a fall from the Tao into the Da, into virtue, into the power of individuals. And then there was a fall from Da into Li, the principles of propriety. And then from the Li into practice, and from practice into thought. So there is this pattern of leaving, falling away from the true relationship to life into theory about it. Theorizing about what is God, what is the world, what am I, what is this about, using the mind to understand things which should be immediately present. The Taoists considered this a fall, and they considered this the reason for the end of a golden age. When people begin to think about truth and stop living and having immediate apperception of it, they are already one step removed from it. And indeed, in the Taoist scriptures, it is written that to approach the Tao with intent is to cause the Tao to flee. To grasp after it is to lose it. There's a story about a Zen monk who came to his teacher and who asked, "How can I find this Tao?" The Zen teacher responded, "The Tao is your ordinary consciousness." This is the answer that Zen will, of course, find to the question of what is the real, true human existence, the conscious existence, ordinary consciousness. Taoism stressed the importance of life in the small things, in the newness of things, in activity. Sweeping the floor to the Taoist could be a very spiritual, very interesting, very exciting activity. What makes it not so is the mind deciding, this is boring, or I've done this 7,000 times, or why do this, it's just going to get dusty again, or I would rather do something else. The mind helps us to decide that what we are doing at this moment is not good to do. But the Taoists would respond that the amount of attention that has to be given in life to food, to self-preservation, to keeping things clean is in itself an indication of the requirements of life and where the real value of life is available. We have the idea that somehow leisure is connected with the better things in life, that once we get all the work done, then we can do something good for ourselves. The Taoist says no. The Taoist says it is when you are doing the things that you must do that the real opportunity for growth is present. It is then, by having the right attitude and the right understanding of the action that you do, that you can truly develop your consciousness and your humanity. How does one proceed to such development? The figure on the far left represents Tao. It is a face on the right and a footstep on the left. The footstep on the left, basically, watch each step. This is what's being said. Be aware of each step. It is not think about each step, as it is in Confucianism, but rather be aware. This is an art which is very difficult for us to develop, in that our culture is a supremely young kind of culture, and is very reason-oriented, very outward-oriented. This awareness, rather, is a yin quality, is a receptiveness. The word passivity has been used, but it is perhaps not an accurate word, for the simple reason that within this receptiveness there is a kind of motion, there is a kind of activity. And in fact, in the famous yin-yang diagram, which I will not attempt to draw for you, there is usually a point within the thickest part of each of the waves of light and dark, and that point indicates the potency of the other force within the one in question. Within yin, there is a bit of yang, and within yang, there is a bit of yin. So receptivity might be a better way for us to consider this. Receiving and understanding of what it is we are doing. Emerson picked up on aspects of this and would talk about man with a capital M doing whatever activity it was that the individual was doing. In other words, all of humanity, all the world was there sweeping the floor. And sweeping the floor suddenly had cosmic proportions about it. In fact, if one wished to take the time, and if one had sufficient awareness, one could look at the sweeping of the floor and find laws having to do with the very creation and existence of the cosmos in the activity. Now we, tending to intellectualize this, find it somehow humorous or at the very least strange. However, the Taoist would take joy in it, would take great pleasure in the comfort of knowing that so simple an activity has such cosmic proportions to it, that in a sense the entire cosmos echoes through every activity, echoes through the most apparently mundane aspects of our lives. Daoism painted pictures in terms of water, the feminine, the valley, the ocean. The practical advice in Daoism had to do with, if you wish to lead, then go to the back. If you wish to go forward, move backward. Now, of course, reason makes this into nonsense. But if we listen with the heart, there is an understanding here having to do with the flow of the current and the understanding that the world is made up of polarity. And the Taoist would say that to desire pleasure is yang, but to see the pain that comes with pleasure is yin. The balance is where the human consciousness should rest, in the understanding that with pleasure there is pain. The Taoist sees all of reality in this sense of polarities, sees that without beauty there would be no ugliness, and without ugliness there would be no beauty, that light and dark create each other, that masculine and feminine are complementary to one another, that polarities define each other, that happy experiences are only happy in relief against sad ones. It can somehow amaze us when we read about primitive cultures and the tremendous ecstasies that children can have over the simplest things that to us have little meaning. But within the context of such a child's life, that happiness stands out against a kind of sadness that is very different from our own. And therefore the sadness itself provides definition for the happiness. A good example is that of a lizard. If one were a mosquito and one saw the gaping jaws of a lizard about to open and chew us up, we would think that that lizard was the very personification of evil in the world, that there could be nothing more devilish than that lizard. However, if we are a man and we are tormented by the mosquito and are afraid of contracting malaria, and we have some friendly lizards in the room who eat the mosquitoes, why, that lizard is a very useful and good creature, virtually put here for our own benefit. Relative, defined by polarities. It all depends on the perspective. The Taoist attempts to be aware of this at all times. When something good happens to the Taoist, it is accepted graciously. When something bad happens, it also is accepted graciously. There's a wonderful old story about a farmer, old Taoist story. His horse ran away, and all the neighbors came and said, "So sorry that your horse ran away." And he said, "It's all right." And they said, "Well, it was a bad thing." He said, "Maybe." The next day the horse came back with 5 wild horses. All the neighbors came and they said, "What a wonderful thing to happen." He said, "Maybe." The next day his son threw a saddle on the wild horse, fell off the horse and broke his leg. All the neighbors came and they said, "Terrible thing." And he said, "Maybe." But the next day the officials came to bring young men into the army, and of course they didn't take the boy because his leg was broken. And of course everyone came and said, "What a fortunate thing." And he said, "Maybe." This is the Taoist approach. Now, both the Confucian and the Taoist can be taken to extremes. The Confucians, hundreds of years later, were very well known for being very rigid people. They were extremely concerned with propriety, with what should be done. And the Taoists, in response to this, tended to become rather wild. There are some wonderful stories also about that. There was a school of neo-Taoists hundreds of years later who practiced what they called silent conversation. And what this meant was that they would go out with a large bowl of wine and they would begin to drink it. They would write poems for each other, and they would tell stories and argue about philosophy, meanwhile getting drunker and drunker. And finally, hopefully, if they were in harmony and the timing was good, they would pass out just as they ran out of things to say. And this was silent conversation. There was also another Taoist master who took great pleasure in irritating his Confucian neighbors. He used to, for instance, love to walk around his house in the nude, which was to the Confucian tremendously improper. And one day when visited by 2 of his Confucian neighbors, he answered the door in the nude. The Confucians were justly horrified and said, "How can you do such a thing?" And he smiled at them and said, "The world is my body. Why are you in my pants?" Now, we can be humane and think that what we're seeing here is corrective measure, that the Confucians, seeing the wildness of the Taoists, were a bit too rigid and tending to provide a good example, and the Taoists, seeing the rigidness of the Confucians, were a little too wild, trying to loosen them up a bit. In reality, there was a balance struck. We'll especially focus on that during the second half of the lecture. Now, Confucianism developed in an interesting way, and this should be brought out. It was not popular during Confucius's lifetime. He was well known and was a respected teacher. However, as we have said, most of the leaders of the period were not kindly disposed to him. After his death, a school of philosophy very similar to our logical, to our positivist approach, became dominant. It was called the legalist school. The idea of the legalist school, which may sound familiar to us, was that the law was the law. What the leader, what the ruler said was law, and a person who obeyed the law should be well rewarded, and a person who disobeyed should be well punished. That was the entirety of the philosophy. It became very popular amongst one of the more primitive of the city-states. And it was in fact this state that, with a combination of the practice of that law and with their own warlike, according to the Confucians, barbarity, won out over the other states and unified China for a time under a very brutal rule. It did not last long, however. Rebellion spread, and so hated was this legalist philosophy that once the rulers had been overthrown, the sage who was responsible for it was hunted down and killed in a merciless, tortured manner, in a sense expressing the hatred of the people for what had been done to them. From that time onward, Confucianism became the dominant philosophy in China. So dominant, in fact, that for hundreds of years, every civil servant would have to take exams testing his knowledge of the Confucian scriptures. If one wished to become what we would call a politician, one would have to be a learned and intelligent Confucian. Otherwise, there was no hope. And in fact, many brilliant young men who formed other philosophical schools were frustrated in this very honorable desire for civil employment because they could not or would not master the Confucian writings. This did have good effect. There was a long peace in China under Confucian rule. It must be said, though, that the overly young quality showed itself, and that there was a tendency for the Confucian officials, after hundreds of years, to appear virtuous. The idea became that if one looked good, that was enough. What was inside was unimportant. This could be argued as a neglect of the aspect which Daoism refers to. A little bit too much Confucianism, a little too little Daoism. Daoism being as internal as it is, as unconcerned with the rest of the world. We can remember Lao Tzu's attack against Confucius, that he was much too concerned with what other people thought. Demands a kind of honesty that Confucianism may not. It would be possible, if one were sufficiently hypocritical, to practice Confucianism being dishonest. One would simply practice propriety as it should be done and not really mean it. Be insincere, in other words. It would be impossible to practice Daoism insincerely. Daoism is an internal philosophy. It is so internal, in fact, that it is not possible to honestly fool oneself about it. Daoism developed a meditational discipline that was indigenous to China and was evidently somewhat well developed. It was superseded, however, by the Buddhist, and we have completely lost trace of it. We really do not know, except for one or two references which are heavily fought about by our Western scholars, what this kind of yoga was. We know it had something to do with breathing, some sort of rhythm of breath. What probably happened was that when Buddhism came to China, the Taoists saw that it had such a tremendously well-developed yoga system, so many scriptures and such deep instruction. It was so obviously well thought out that they all but abandoned their own methods, maybe adapted some of them. And we may see in the differences between Zen practice and Hindu practice the influence of this indigenous Taoist approach to meditation. Taoism mixed very well with Buddhism. Confucianism also mixed with Buddhism, perhaps a bit less well. However, it was possible to be a Confucian and also to be Buddhist. The Taoist who became a Buddhist wound up being Zen. Zen did not mix that well with Confucianism, for the simple reason that the Roshi practice of, for instance, throwing a pupil off a bridge when he asks how deep the river is not according to the proprieties of Confucian practice. The Zen teacher comes out of a tradition that mixes the Hindu dislike of this world, the idea that it is illusion, wound up being Zen. Zen did not mix that well with Confucianism, for the simple reason that the Roshi practice of, for instance, throwing a pupil off a bridge when he asks how deep the river is not according to the proprieties of Confucian practice. The Zen teacher comes out of a tradition that mixes the Hindu dislike of this world, the idea that it is illusion and that it is somehow intrinsically damaging to the human soul. This mixes with the Taoist propensity toward moving away from life, from active life, and becomes a very iconoclastic approach, although perhaps very effective. It's interesting, however, to stress that Taoism itself did not have this opinion about the world, this opinion that it was illusion or that it was somehow bad, it was a place where we were entrapped. Like the Confucian, the Taoist saw the world as essentially harmonious. It was the human being who messed things up. It was the human being who was out of whack with the harmony around him or her. The Taoist continually referred to natural examples, to water, to the valley, to the ocean. To the Taoist, all of nature was a tremendous lesson about right behavior and about harmony. It is said that Lao Tzu studied no books in distinction to Confucius, that Lao Tzu simply watched nature, that he would sit on a mountain and watch. He would walk down by a river and watch. And that all his learning came from this. Confucianism, on the other hand, was absolutely unconcerned with metaphysics and with speculation about the whys and the wheres and such. It purported to be a method of being comfortable in this world. The question really was one of, we are here, how do we make it as comfortable as possible? And Confucius saw the answer in a harmony in society, a harmony between persons. The answer was that this life is made good by harmonious interaction with the world and with other individuals, and that this life is made ugly by disharmonious interaction. In this, Taoism and Confucianism are quite similar, and it should be stressed that this end of spontaneity, this end of the sage who is able to act out of desire and still be correct and harmonious, is common to Confucianism and Taoism. Both saw this possibility. Both saw spontaneity as the ultimate good. Both saw spontaneity as the natural state of the human being. So that any feeling that one might get from both of these philosophies, from this idea of step by step and from this idea of obedience to principles of propriety, must be modified by consideration that the difficulty of it, the almost mathematical approach, is only a means toward dropping that approach, toward not having to force it, to be aware, to force propriety. Rather, we must rediscover the roots of spontaneous goodness and harmony within ourselves. And I should add here that my use of the word goodness would not be countenanced by the Taoist. Of course, to the Taoist, good and bad are absolutely relative. So read harmony where I say good. That this intrinsic harmony is natural to the human being. And indeed, that this harmony must be disturbed by real effort. And the effort comes from self-will. It comes from human desire. It comes from bad example. It comes from the fact that in Confucius' time and in our own, most of us grow up in a very disorganized, very disharmonic world. And we are very fortunate to have around us 1, 2, 3 examples of individuals who are even close to developing some kind of original relationship with this harmony, who exemplify the possibilities, the potential goodness that humanity is capable of. Without this kind of example, Confucius would say, what hope is there of truly developing what one is capable of? The Taoist answer is the hope of looking at nature, of looking at heaven and looking at earth, and there receiving the ultimate good examples. We'll take our break now. The second half will be more or less devoted to the fusion of Confucianism and Daoism, and then a little bit of practical talk about how it's put into actual practice. There's two principal focuses here that we can use, and they're indicated by the two figures in the middle. The one on the left, which we haven't discussed yet, is called Shaozhong, and the one on the right is Li, which we have talked about in the Confucian sense of propriety. Li also meant, particularly to the Taoist, the internal orientation or nature of any being, animate or inanimate. The word originally derives from the grain in wood or in jade. That was what was referred to when the word was invented. And in Taoism, discussion of art often has to do with this idea of the true artist being so receptive that he or she is able to bring the figure out of the wood using the natural grain of the wood, bring the figure out of the jade, so that there is never this young chopping of the natural grain, but rather there's a cultivation of what is already present in the materials. This may remind us of Michelangelo, who was once supposed to have been furiously chipping away for a day and a night at a block of marble, and when was asked by one of his students why he was so madly at it, he said that he was trying to free the statue that was caught in the stone. This is a very Taoist kind of perspective. This Li, this natural principle, is best typified by the flow of water, because this gives us the idea of motion, this idea of process. In fact, there is a modern day philosopher who some of you may know of. His name is Alfred North Whitehead, who's an Englishman who came to America, who moved very much against the prevailing tendency in philosophy today, which is very logical and analytical, and he was a full-blown metaphysician and considered himself in the tradition of Plato. And Whitehead believed on the basis of modern science that there was no matter as such in the universe, that everything was process, that everything in the world that could be thought of or named was an event of process. In a sense, a point in time and space where a whole series of causes meet. In that sense, the finished statue of an artist is the combination of, to name just a few causes, the cause of the stone, the cause of the artist, the cause of the artist's teachers, the cause of the influences of all the people that the artist has ever known, the eyes of those who look upon it, the man who made the tool, the material of which the tool was made, etc. All of these combine to finally create the statue. And in fact, Whitehead, who we might add is in complete agreement with Buddhism in this aspect, felt that all things in the universe were thus interconnected. And in fact, in Taoism, we find the statement that the universe, the sun, the stars, are as dependent on a single human being as that human being on the sun and the stars and the universe, that the consciousness that sees them, the single person, is absolutely necessary and is here for a reason and has function. The reason and function is this person's Li. It is the organic rhythm, the organic grain, the principle within the individual. And whether it be called soul or spirit or life becomes irrelevant. The idea simply being that it is alive, that it moves, that it has purpose, and that it has a rhythm that is complementary with all the other rhythms in the world. And Daoism has in fact gone so far as to propose a kind of utopian vision that is unmatched by any other which was produced for thousands of years after. The idea that if everything in the universe were in contact intimately with its Li, that the entire universe would be in harmony, that there would be no requirement for laws and for governments and for these kind of directions, because in essence, all things are naturally harmonious and complementary to one another. It is only in separation from the Li, it is only in separation from the internal grain, the internal principle, that disharmony enters and that the necessity for things like laws comes into being. The Taoist does not have a tremendous amount of respect for that kind of order, believing to a certain extent that it in itself causes as much disorder as it pretends to protect order. There is an old Greek saying that the laws are like a spider's web. They're strong enough so that the flies don't get through, but the hornets rip their way through them. And the Taoists saw things in this way and would even go further and perhaps say that the hornet is encouraged to rip his way through them by the existence of them. This, of course, is utopian, but may describe a vision of the world thousands of years in advance, maybe tens of thousands of our present capabilities. And yet it is somehow a valid one that speaks true about human nature. How, though, does one reach such a millennium or contribute to it? For this we turn to Confucius. Confucius spoke of example. Confucius spoke of the way of living a life so that you, as an individual, one person, is able to bring about change, is able to bring harmony into your realm of being. This was enough. How does one do this? Through the awareness which we have spoken of, and through this other figure, Shaozhong, which we have mentioned. Shaozhong is a phrase that comes out of the Yin and Yang school of philosophy and out of Daoism. It means, loosely, holding to the center. One might say it means holding to the Li. It means somehow being centered. Words absolutely fail in the attempt to describe this. What can be said is that the Taoist meditational practice was undoubtedly an attempt to contact and develop the faculty of holding the center. That Buddhism, and in fact most every yogic practice, is also this attempt to contact and to hold the center. To the Taoist, there was no hope of living a harmonized life without this contact and this holding to the center. In a sense, by doing this, by holding to the center, one harmonizes all the other elements in one's life because the center is put where it should be. In other words, one does not center one's consciousness in the mind or in the desires of one sort or another. These do not become the ruling factor of the life. Now, most individuals which we meet are ruled by these aspects. Perhaps we know someone who is highly analytic. In a sense, they have placed their center in their intellect. We may know someone else who absolutely adores food, and they have placed their center in their desire to eat. The center belongs, tautology, in the center. And the center is unknowable to our words and to our thoughts. This is the great difficulty. And one can easily tell the honest reportage of contact with the center because it will inevitably begin with a statement, these words will not function. They will not suffice for me to communicate to you what I have discovered, but I have to try. Please try to read between the lines. In a sense, then, of all scriptures, the Taoist is the most honest because it begins with the statement, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. The entire scripture is now invalid to reason. You are forewarned, in a sense, that what you are going to read is nonsense. It is nonsense to the sense of intellect. How then do we approach this? How do we find ourselves some bearings? Well, it is possible to do some reading. This would be Confucius's approach. It is good to read what the ancients and what the moderns have to say about their experiences of life. We can perhaps avoid errors which they had made and which they had corrected. We can perhaps see insights. Very often in reading these kind of works, experiences which were very vague to us suddenly become crystallized in the text and are reflected back at us. And in fact, we very often find that when we read these great writings, we are reading a record of our own thoughts and beliefs, phrased in a way that makes them clear to us. Emerson used to like to point out that in reading a genius, there was proof that every individual was a genius, because it would take a genius to appreciate a genius. And obviously the only difference was that the one being read could express it. To the Taoist, expression is in itself a bit of a mistake. It is an indication of the expression of an internal urge. Now, what the urge is becomes a question for the Confucian. For the Confucian, one must judge whether this urge is motivated by an honest desire to communicate something of help, by a sense of service, or if it is an urge for self-aggrandizement. There were later Taoists who felt that Confucius was the greater sage because he never spoke of Tao. They assumed that one as wise as Confucius must have known about the Tao and about the principles as they functioned within the individual. But that he was so wise that he never sought to speak of it, that rather he provided a program of activity that would help a person to open up their own understanding of it. No words were thus wasted. Therefore, Lao Tzu was understood to be a less supreme sage because he still had the urge to speak of it and still tried to bend those words tortuously into saying something that could not be said. In our personal lives, we face a continual rhythm, a continual flux of energy that is very much distinct by its division into two polarities. We don't need to call them yin and yang. We don't need to draw those particular polarities. But we can see that life tends to be an up and down affair, not in general only, but also simply in the movements of the day, the small things. That an activity itself has this characteristic of beginning quietly, perhaps interest, attention builds, excitement builds, it subsides. A new interest is engaged, the activity, the interest, the attention grows, becomes more intense, and again subsides. This rhythm is, in fact, the rhythm of the Tao. And the trick, the key to living a good life is coincidence with that rhythm, is learning to live within that rhythm naturally rather than fighting it. Trouble usually begins when an individual decides that they want to do something when the rhythm says it should not be done. Now, in our society, the tendency is to think that in such a case, something needs to be done to correct the situation. So that, for instance, if one is ill, one takes medicine to get better. Taoists might argue that, for instance, if you have a cold or you have the flu, that you should have the cold or have the flu. You should take care of yourself, but you should allow your body to do what it's doing, freeing itself of toxin or whatever it might be. Perhaps it's forcing you to rest. this idea that we have in modern society of doing what we wish to do in spite of the natural rhythms around us has a lot to do with the subject-object distinction we have in our society, our scientific approach to things. There is the human being and there is the world. The world is manipulated by the human being. This was absolutely foreign to Daoism in particular, but also to Confucianism. The world expressed human beings. Human beings were very much a part of nature. Human beings, their cities, their most logically scientific endeavors were expressions of nature. The ugly tin cans that get thrown down in the park were nature. They were expressions of nature because man is an expression of nature. This understanding immediately brings us into a different perspective in dealing with the world. Rather than deciding what we want to do, rather than deciding that we're in a position of freedom, we can choose what we shall do, we begin to look around at what we can do with the world rather than to it. What kind of things can be done to enhance or to live in harmony with? What we reap by our activity is becoming painfully obvious. The dangerous conditions in the environment, the increasing incidence of pollution are all indications that this kind of manipulative attitude is not functional, that the human being has not sufficient wisdom when working out of the intellect to manipulate the world and succeed. Too many things are not seen. The fact that something so simple as a chemical in a spray could effectively destroy life on Earth is an indication of this lack of awareness. If we were going to choose examples of our end, we certainly wouldn't choose something so ignoble. But it demonstrates the tremendous complexity and interrelatedness of nature as pointed out by Daoism, and the necessity of being in harmony with it. The necessity of understanding that we are not all aware, that we must seek to live in the world, to live with the world, and not rather to manipulate it. Having this attitude, we can then look around us and find that everything is a lesson, that everything we see somehow teaches us or provides us an opportunity for our own development of understanding. We can see that a beautiful scenery, a landscape, has lessons for us. Lao Tzu was able to look at the ocean, and he pointed out that all the great, mighty, raging rivers flowed down into the sea. Why? Because the sea was lowest of them all, and it received them all. Lao Tzu was able to watch fish swimming in the river, and was able to notice that they went with the current, that they went with the li, with the flow of the rhythm of the water, and therefore they didn't drown. They swam. And that men who were good swimmers knew this and were following the flow of the water, and that this was the key. In fact, that a human being successful at anything, good at anything, is a human being who has brought into play an aspect of the li, of the principle, of this internal grain. They are expressing something natural to themselves. And we can now take this idea of manipulating nature, of doing what we wish, and apply it to our society. And note how often we get it into our minds that we would like to be such and such, whatever it might be. Something we see that looks good to us, it looks exciting, and we would like to be like that, not realizing that the person or the situation which we would wish to imitate is expressing its own natural principle, and is doing it well, perhaps, and is therefore worthy as an example. But that our own natural grain may be something a bit different. But every bit as excellent if we are able to develop its potential. The key is in deriving an understanding of what that is. This is where the mind fails. One cannot sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper and begin to tabulate what one's internal grain is. Perhaps, if one is very fortunate, we will distract the mind so much that the intuition will slip the answer in and we can throw out the paper. However, it is only through the cultivation of awareness that this intuition speaks. And it is through the cultivation of this awareness that we can discover the internal grain that is ourselves. It is very easy to think of examples of individuals in history who in various fields, whichever one would like to mention, were brilliantly creative, brilliantly innovative, were somehow exemplary. And it is very frustrating to look at them and to wonder, why them? There is a feeling of somehow inequality. Why should there have been a Michelangelo when I can't even draw a flower on a piece of paper? Why should there have been a Shakespeare when writing a dialogue is impossible for me? It's difficult enough to engage in one. What we need to understand is there is not an inequality here, that we also have a Li, a principle within us that is every bit as dramatic and capable as those to which we look, for example. That there is perhaps a different kind of Li. And the danger is when we misinterpret the individual's action as the only means of approach, when perhaps early in life we are influenced by a certain individual and we decide we want to be that individual. We want to do what they do. If they are a musician, then we wish to be a great concert pianist. If they are a painter, then we wish to rival Raphael. What we should be looking at, rather, is the example of this person's having actualized their internal grain, their internal principle. That is the true example. This is what should be looked upon and should give us actually inspiration, because each of these individuals who so dramatizes human capabilities shows us the possibilities of ourselves, what we can accomplish. That the world is in the condition that it is, and that so many individuals feel lost, is not a function of lack of ability. It is not because we are incapable of doing better. It is because we do not see that we can do better, because we try to do things that are perhaps against our grain. There are individuals who work their lives attempting to master a craft or an art. And they work very hard at it, and they never approach a real level of accomplishment. And they have continual frustrations. And one would be very tempted to point out and say, doesn't it ever occur to you that all of these frustrations, all this misery, is a very loud message coming to you from nature that you are going against the grain? Now, perhaps such an individual becomes very bitter and says that the world is a bad place, that if there is such a thing as the human soul, why doesn't it have free expression? And why is it that I worked my whole life to do this, and Shakespeare, well, he had virtually no education, and when he was 30 years old, he was writing brilliant plays, and on and on and on and on, basically justifying this sense of misery. The realization which they refuse to meet, and perhaps this is quite understandable, because a person who has invested 40 years in an activity to discover that it will not work certainly does not want to face the fact that it was their own blindness, their own lack of awareness that caused them to spend the 40 years in the activity that wouldn't work. And to blame the world is a gross negligence of the fact, of the reality of the situation. How then does one begin to develop the awareness of the Li? Well, we saw the figure of the Tao, step by step. We do not sit down and decide, makes sense, I'm going to now discover my Li and work at it like Confucius did. We don't eat and we meditate all day and all night and discover it was a waste of time. This is not the correct approach, and in fact shows us that with all his virtues, Confucius may have lacked a little bit of patience. What we do instead is we move slowly. We cultivate the interest. We decide that we will keep this question with us, that we will consider it often, not in the sense of analyzing and beating our brains over it, trying to discover what the truth is. Rather, that we will simply, gently live with the question. We will open ourselves to an awareness of who we are, of what we are. And then we will allow the world to show us. We will allow our friends and our experiences and the situations that we find ourselves in to define us, to reflect back to us what it is that they desire. It's rather comical to discover that sometimes it's something so obvious that it is amazing to us that we missed it. It is so obvious that, in fact, it is unglamorous, and we decide that it isn't exactly what we want to do, that it's well, we do it well, but we don't really want to do it. This is, again, the mind entering and defeating the situation. The mind painting a picture for you of how it will be, and then cutting it to pieces and leaving you helpless before it. Until you enter the situation, you do not know what it will be like. And we are told, and I would stress with all the other voices, that when you are practicing the Li, when you are practicing this ability, when you sacrifice what must be sacrificed to practice it, in other words, all the desires for things that you would like to do, but which you really are not equipped to do, the satisfaction begins to enter. You begin to discover that indeed you do like to do this, and doors open for you. And you discover that it seems as though you provide a function that the people around you must have. You discover that you are somehow an absolutely necessary part of the way that things are, and that the function which you discharge is so intrinsic to you that you may feel that it is not even yourself who does it. Someone may come to you and say to you, "Wow, you're such an amazing painter. How do you do that?" If they start telling you, if the answer is, "Oh, I work very hard in this or that," they're playing a game with you. Because the really good ones will say, "I'll tell you, I don't really know. It's not me that paints it. Oh, I worked, but somehow it just gets painted, and I stand and look at it, and I'm as amazed as anybody else is, maybe more so, because I don't know how it got made." There you have a person who is practicing the Li. There you have a person who is expressing that internal grain, who has found their orientation in life. Now, there is a trap door here, however, and that is again the one of impatience, because as we begin to discover that, we would love for everything to open immediately, that we should have endless opportunities to express this newfound talent that we have. It is not necessarily so. It may be, but it is not necessarily so. It may be that it takes time. It may be that we must learn other things and more patience. It is amazing to read the biographies that we have of such individuals who seem to have discovered their Li. We find that they are lost for the first 30, 35 years of life, some of them for the first 50 years of life. They simply do not know what they are supposed to do. And then one day, things conspire, and they start doing it. And they do it very, very well. And they discover that all the things which they had done those other 50 years, which they thought were just useless, were wasting time, daily things, the work that they did out in the garden, or the discussions they had with a particularly cantankerous uncle, that all of this somehow contributed to what it was they were destined, if you like, to do. In other words, all of this was a cultivation of the Li, of the internal grain, of the internal principle, bringing awareness of its different facets to the individual, making it possible for the individual to bring it into full flower of expression when the opportunity was presented. Usually, they also feel that if they had done it earlier, it would have been too early. That if they had discovered this talent 10 years earlier, they would not have had an avenue of expression. Well, they might say vague things like the world wasn't ready, or I simply didn't know the right people, or that sort of thing. But the fact remains that the timing somehow wasn't right. They were not ripe, but also the situation had not ripened sufficiently to provide them with the necessary opportunities for expression. Really, the problem of the Li, of finding the internal core of the self and learning how to express it is the great problem of human life. Most of the things that cause us anxiety, most of the problems that we face are in some way derived from that. And the proof of this is that if you think about something that you do, that you get extraordinary pleasure from doing and that you do well, and when you perhaps have spent several hours in doing it, and you stop, and you go into a situation, and you run into someone who is miserable, they just don't bother you. It just isn't the same. In fact, you might be able to cheer them up. You have an entirely different focus. You feel calm, you feel satisfied and at peace with yourself. And therefore, the part of you which would respond to their anger or their depression does not respond. It simply accepts it, remains calm, like the water that Lao Tzu so much liked to contemplate. So many anxieties fall away from us when we discover and begin to apply this principle of the Li. Because we are actually in harmony with the world. Because we are actually doing what we are meant to do. It is no less than that. When we are not in harmony, then we are continually running against frustrations, irritations, opposition. And it is a very clear sign when these things begin to accumulate in our lives that we are somehow doing something wrong. And it is very useful to think about it, to take a moment, slip into a reflective state of consciousness. Don't analyze, rather, but simply notice. Perhaps you will discover that what you thought was a tremendous existential crisis as you faced death and were frightened and completely unable to function, and you didn't understand how the rest of the world could possibly be so blind as to miss what was so clear to you, you might discover that you're indulging your love of being misunderstood. And that's all that you're doing. And you may discover that once you realize it, you stop indulging it. You just laugh and you move along to the next step. If you do not discover the reason, then at least be calm and know that the reason is there, probably as clear as can be, but somehow in the muddle of the experience, it's being missed. Somehow it just isn't quite coming to the consciousness. Even though the world may be screaming at you about what you're doing wrong, you're not really listening, and you really don't quite know what's being told to you. You just hear a general din, and you consider that perhaps the world is righteously proclaiming your guilt. In fact, all the pain that you might suffer is not that, but the world attempting to communicate to you that you are out of harmony, and that it is a simple thing for you to realize in what way you are and to adjust it. This is applicable in the mind, it is applicable in the body, and it is applicable in the soul, in emotions, in spirituality. If the body becomes ill, you can be sure that there is something wrong in the way that it's being treated or in the environment. You can also be sure that if you are seriously ill, that your mind and your emotions are somehow involved, that there is a root disharmony at work, something that has become so well ingrained that it is gouging the natural grain of the Li, of your being. And in rebellion against that, the body, the mind, the emotions reel into sickness, throwing you completely out of context. A modern German philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger once pointed out that one doesn't really know what a hammer is, though one uses it every single day, because the hammer is simply a tool and we're involved in the flow of using it, and we just aren't aware of it. It's what he called transparent. But one day the hammer breaks, and we need it. And then we know what the hammer is. And it is the same thing with our thought processes and our bodies. To get our attention, to make us realize that we are doing something wrong, misusing something, sometimes that something has to be broken. It has to be taken out of commission so that we can see it. We can suddenly realize, for instance, that it must be that when I played racquetball yesterday, I did something wrong because I can't use my right hand and I need to write today and I can't. You begin to appreciate that you cannot live so recklessly with the body, that you must have a sense of awareness with that too. Now this does not mean that one should be morbidly concerned with the body, the emotions, and the mind. At those times when we are tempted to become so, we should keep in mind again that the Tao, the way that can be traveled, is not the eternal way. It means that the way that we conceptualize, our idea of the way we should go, is not the way. It takes us back to spontaneity. So in a sense, in approaching all of this, we have to move in an oblique pattern. We can't decide, I will develop my awareness and then set to developing our awareness. Rather, what we have to do is, we have to begin to simply cultivate our lives. We have to begin to cultivate our awareness. We have to go and enjoy beauty. Perhaps we read. Perhaps we converse. We spend time a little more carefully. We allow ourselves to be stimulated in ways that we know opens our awareness. Each of us knows what kind of things has this effect on us, have this kind of opening effect. There are activities which provide us with a sense of satisfaction and openness, sometimes to the extent that it hurts us to stop the activity because we wish that we could maintain that quality of openness on and on. Those are the activities that are worthy of cultivation. And if they stop providing that, then perhaps it is time to change them, to modify them, to open them up further, or perhaps to discard them in favor of some new activity which was beyond us when we began earlier. We need to realize that our potential is quite infinite. And there are all sorts of hysterically useless logical proofs of the infinite consciousness of the human being, and I'll only burden you with one of them, which is that even if we could catalog every thought we've ever had, we'd have to catalog the thought of cataloging it. And then we'd have to catalog the thought of cataloging the catalog. And then you see it's infinite. There's always another number in the series. It always goes on a step further. That consciousness is where we live. There's a phenomenal drawing that someone made of how the human body looks to the human consciousness. It would really surprise all of you to see it, because it looks nothing like it does in the mirror. To the individual, evidently, it's all hands and face. And there are parts of it which are almost non-existent because they're never thought about. They're never touched, never seen. Our body is not a tremendous part of our consciousness. In fact, for many of us, it's more a nuisance, which we somehow have to deal with, and it's quite useful in the sense that it takes us where we want to go. That's about the extent of it. We really do live in our consciousness. And in fact, noticing that, there have been philosophers in the West who have decided that there are no objects in the world. There's only sense data. In other words, there's only our experience of the world, and no world to experience. This is something that logic can provide for you if you're interested. The important thing about that opinion, though, is the stress on the importance of human consciousness, that we do live in that. And in alchemy, and there was a promise of a little Chinese alchemy, so we'll throw it in here near the end. In alchemy, including Chinese alchemy, it is this human consciousness that is the crucible. Any of you who have read alchemy might have seen the illustration of a glass crucible. And you might have read that it has to do with the body, or it has to do with that or this. But it's the consciousness, because that is the body in which we really live. And that is the body where the alchemical process of transmutation takes place. And it is very interesting to note that Chinese alchemy is very similar to its Western counterpart. It is the same interest in the making of gold, cloaking a spiritual discipline. It has the same wonderful symbolic language describing the means by which an individual develops an enlightened, aware state of consciousness. It is really the same approach. It is interesting, in fact, and leads many individuals to speculate about whether or not there was influence between one and the other. Could it have been that they mutually derived from Egypt, or could it have been that somehow the Chinese passed through India, and through India to Palestine, and through Palestine into Greece and on to us? Really, it doesn't matter whether they spontaneously arise together, whether the Taoist had no intercourse whatsoever with his European counterpart, is totally unimportant, because the fact is that it was their experience of this alchemical process, this transformation of human consciousness, that led them to continue discussing, continue writing about their experiences of it. If it had not been true, then though it had come through China and had come through Palestine and all the rest, it would not have taken root. It takes a certain amount of enthusiasm for an individual to sit down and express to you what they have discovered, particularly when they do so in a symbolic language that they know very few will understand. This is an expression of an inner urgency. And you may believe that the vast majority of alchemists, particularly the most respected ones, did not do it because they were going to make money from it, because they did not. In fact, they put their lives in danger by writing these works. Most were anonymous, and they certainly did not see any money from having written them. This was an expression of a need to describe and to preserve an experience. And in fact, we can look at Taoism, at this attempt, the Lao Tzu, to write down such experience as an expression of the same inner urgency. And so, when we reach a point in life when our disharmony with the rhythms of the day, and these are the rhythms that should be focused on, in fact, the simplest rhythms. It's a wonderful thing that the sun provides us with such a very handy section of hours in which to do our work, and that it shifts enough that in summer we can experience a large field of work and in winter a small. If we just limit ourselves to the day, and even limit ourselves down from that to the activity that's before us at the moment, if we can be present to that activity, and in that activity seek to discover the yin and the yang, to flow with it,